There's so many legal tech solutions out there that are built not with the attorneys in mind or not with adoption in mind. There's a lot of things out there that are just built to say, hey, we have this that does X, Y, Z. But then you ask the question, well, is anybody using it? One of our big focuses on the innovation side at Ogletree is, okay, well, what are our usage stats? Are people actually using this? Because if not, let's do something else. Let's pivot, let's move it, or let's cancel that, and let's see where we can better direct our resources.
My name's Tom Baldwin. This is Overruled by Data, the podcast for law firms looking to start their data journey or accelerate the journey they're already on. Brought to you by Integrata. Today's guest has one of the most distinctive career arcs in legal technology. Tim went from mailman to litigator to AI co-founder to now the person setting the data and AI strategy for one of the largest labor and employment law firms in the country. Tim Fox is the first ever chief and data AI officer at Ogletree Deakins, a firm with more than 1,100 lawyers and 60 offices across the globe. He didn't arrive there in the traditional path that we see today. As I mentioned, he was a mailman, then we went into the technology sector, spent 7 years practicing as a litigator, then co-founded Legalmation, and now he's at Ogletree since 2020, leading practice intelligence and analytics. And in 2026, just this year, was elevated to the C-suite to lead the firm's entire AI and data vision. He also teaches at USC Gould School of Law, my alma mater, and serves on the California Judicial Council's IT Advisory Committee. Today, we'll dig into what he's learned, what's changed, and where he sees data and AI headed next. Tim Fox, welcome to Overruled by Data.
Yeah, thank you. Very happy to be here.
So we mentioned, Tim, your path is a little unique from being a mailman to getting your computer science degree, working in the Fortune 500, going to law school, being a litigator, founding an AI company, which is pretty cool, and now in the C-suite. What's that through line look like for you?
Yeah, right. I wish I could go back in time 30 years ago and plan this whole thing out. But it really has been much more, I think, for me, a focus on technology and then figuring out where to leverage technology as whatever career path I was on. So, I was a mailman back in the early 2000s. I think there's a lot of parallels there because in the mail back then, email was just getting started and mail volume was way down and people were talking about how this was the end of the profession. And now here we are 26 years later. Now the current career that I'm in is having similar conversations, right? About AI coming in and this is the end of the profession, as should be obvious by the fact that we still all get mail, at least for now. It was not the end of that profession, and hopefully it's not going to be the end of the legal profession. If anything, I haven't checked stats, but I don't think there's been a significant decrease in the number of mail carriers. As we'll hopefully talk about, there's been no decrease in the number of attorneys over the past few years. We keep churning out more and more from law schools and elsewhere.
And you've written about the moment in 2016 when your managing partner came back from Harvard, panicking about AI, then that panic became Legalmation. What did you learn from building something from scratch that you couldn't have learned any other way?
I don't think I want to go back and do a startup again. I think that's one of the main takeaways there. There's a ton that you learn when you have to build something from scratch. And it was also part of transition, right? Going from litigating every day to building a software product is a huge transition. And I think at the time, I don't think any of us understood what we were undertaking then. As an attorney, you feel like you can do anything, right? You become an expert on something for 6, 12 months, you go to trial, and then you learn something new. We approached it, I think, a lot like that as we were all litigators at the time, that we can learn this. We've done these multi-million, $100 million trials. Of course, we can launch a software company. Back then, AI really wasn't very good. This was using, a really what I would consider crude methodologies now to get where we are. And we still managed to build an industry-leading product, an award-winning product then with the technology that we had. One of the big takeaways that I had from that was that really anything is possible. If you have the right people, if you have the right team, if you have the right mindset, you can succeed in areas that are difficult and challenging. That has really helped shape my focus here at Ogletree, and how we've grown is to say, okay, well, let's get the right team together and let's get the right tech stack together, and then we can really build. I think it's also, one of the takeaways from that was just learning a lot about how software development works. Being able to speak that language of here's how you actually build solutions and here's how you build tools. I think that there's a big gap in the current legal environment. Generative AI, to a certain extent, is making that gap bigger. Now you can go into Claude and you can build a proof of concept. You can build an app in a weekend. You can say, this is fantastic. I want to deploy this firm-wide. And you can't, right? The building that proof of concept is stage one, and then being able to scale that to an enterprise-wide application that meets all of your security standards, actually reliable, and that somebody can support and all of that is an order of magnitude more difficult than it is to just go out and vibe code something. And so I think a lot of folks who haven't gone through that sort of boot camp of having to build your own product, deploy it, secure it, scale it, think that it's just as easy as, going in and typing and vibe coding something, and then there you go. I think it's great to have that ability to vibe code and build tools because it's great for proof of concepting. It's great for ideation, but you have to be realistic and say, okay, what I'm building here is just for me. That ability to build, develop software and understand how that works and speak that language is something that has really assisted me in my career and differentiates what we're able to do at the firm than a lot of other firms who don't necessarily have that background and expertise.
We could probably spend an entire hour talking about the merits of vibe coding versus the path you went down of learning the hard way what it's like to build software. Having been a CIO and CKO for decades, I thought I knew a lot about technology. It is very different running and building a software product than it is being in tech. And so I appreciate that perspective quite a bit. Then there's always this pivot, I think, in everyone's journey where data goes from something you just sort of think of in the background to it becoming a really strategic asset. Was there a moment where it just sort of clicked that like, okay, we need to harness our data for more than just a report that sits in someone's inbox, but is actually a competitive advantage?
So my legal tech career has been largely data focused, right? At Legal Nation, what we were doing, we were extracting data. And then what we were enabling you to do was automate what you could do with that data. But the key piece of that was the data extraction. And at Ogletree, it's similar. When I joined the firm, this was pre-generative AI. This was back in 2020. There was a lot of focus on data extraction. What more can we do with the data that we have? And that hasn't necessarily changed. It's gotten actually a lot easier with generative AI because now I don't need a team of, 5 people to go build me this extraction algorithm and locate the data. We can do that much easier, but still the data is a key piece for everything. And I think we're going to see more and more emphasis on data and data-enabled law firms. That's what a lot of people are talking about. There's a couple of examples I can think of where it's really clicked. And a lot of that has to do not so much with me, because I understand the data, I get the data, but it's when there's that connection where what I think is important in data is what my attorneys also think is important in data. One of the things that we did early on at Ogletree was we built a settlement extractor. It extracted 30 plus data points from class action settlement agreements to create a repository of that data, because class action settlement agreements are generally publicly available. It's complicated to locate the data, and you have to extract the data, and then you have to make that data accessible. Each one of those has its own challenges, but the biggest one I would say now with generative AI has simplified the first two, making it easier to locate and extract. But the third is making it accessible. How do you make that data accessible to attorneys who aren't data-focused people? Because it's easy to make data accessible to people who understand SQL queries, right? And can query a database, can go out there and do all of that. You don't have to teach them anything. But for an attorney, you need to make sure that data is intuitive and that it's accessible and they can answer their questions and even know what questions to ask. As an example, we queried, I think, 20,000 plus settlement agreements. I think we extracted whatever that is as far as data points, several 100,000 data points, and then putting those together in a way that our attorney could go in and look up that data. That was somewhat of an eye-opener both for them, but also for us. It's not enough for us to just have the data. If that data is not being used, if it's not being made accessible, it wasn't worth our effort. There's so many legal tech solutions out there that are built not with the attorneys in mind or not with adoption in mind. There's a lot of things out there that are just built to say, hey, we have this that does X, Y, Z. But then you ask the question, well, is anybody using it, right? A lot of times that's where you can't get answers to that question, or that's where, things change. And so one of our big focuses on the innovation side at Ogletree is, okay, well, what are our usage stats? Are people actually using this? Because if not, let's do something else. Let's pivot, let's move it, or let's cancel that, and let's see where we can better direct our resources.
Pulling on that string a little bit of external data, you've talked quite a bit about combining firm data with external data. Where do you see that combination creating the most leverage? Is it client service, pricing, risk, or something else?
I think it goes for all of those, but from my perspective, where we get the biggest bang for the buck from it is really from a competitive advantage. When our attorneys can go out there and talk to a client and say, we have all of your data going back X number of years. We've run some analysis on it. We've potentially run forecasting on it. Or, I've had clients come to me and say, hey, can you pull this data, not just for me, but for my 3 competitors? Because I want to be able to go to my board and show that we are actually doing better than them. I've had attorneys do the same. It says, hey, can you go pull all of their other cases, pull their matters, figure out what we can to give them a report that shows that Ogletree is doing a better job. We're decreasing the number of claims that they have, or the number of charges, or the number of actions that they have against them. That's where we get the biggest, from my perspective, value from the data and pulling that together, because there's so few ways that we on the data side can impact the bottom line of the firm, right? We're not out there generally billing, we're only tangentially related to bringing in business, things like that. But being able to impress a client like that, being able to jump on a pitch call and be able to talk about that or send a report to a client that does that helps differentiate. That's one of the ways that we can actually help the firm, help the attorneys actually, bring in business and help the bottom line.
So speaking of adoption and usage, you've talked about the 4 barriers to AI adoption. Walk us through those. Is there one that you think kills more initiative than the others?
It's interesting. When I initially wrote that article, I think it was over a year ago now. It's funny how quickly some things change, but how other things just stay the same. The 4 that I talked about is one, can I trust the output, right? I think we still hear that from people that, well, it hallucinates. There was just articles this week of the largest fine issued for a hallucination in a case, I think it was over $100,000, and people being referred to their bar organizations, things like that. Second is, I'm going to lose billable hours, right? This takes away my billable time. Third, I don't have time to learn this. Then fourth, my work is too specialized. There's no way an AI can replicate what I can do. For folks who have been in the space, there are responses to each of those arguments, right? I mean, can I trust the output? Well, you're supposed to verify. Everything's supposed to be human in the loop, right? You're supposed to be reading that. You're supposed to check all of those citations there. But as I said then, oftentimes when people are saying, well, I don't trust the output, it's much more that there's something else going on. And it's figuring out what is that actual underlying objection to it. We've had, I'd say, a lot of success in overcoming a lot of these objections. That's not to say that they're not there and that some attorneys aren't present. But, when I look at our adoption stats and I look at the attorneys that are using it, we're in the 70 to 80% monthly active users across our attorneys, across our platform. That for me is a huge accomplishment for us as a group, as a team. I'm not taking credit for that because I have a team that is responsible for that. I think that really shows that we've addressed a lot of those, because now what we have left to get to our late adopters and our laggards, right? When you're looking at those adoption curves. That's a great place for us to be. And it's a much different place than we were, 18 months ago when we were rolling out some of our first tools and trying to convince people to get there. From my perspective, what I see as firms that are further along in the maturation, their AI, is that really where I see a lot of focus now is less so on can I trust the output? That's still there, but that's really, like I was saying, more of a catch-all for other concerns. It's a lot, we're seeing, I think, concerns around billable hours. What is the impact on the firm here? We've all been moving so fast to get this technology adopted that now it's somewhat looking back and saying, okay, how does this impact us now? Where are we going to be in 2030? And is this going to have a significant impact on our revenue going forward? And how do we plan for that? How do we get ahead of that? Because for us, from my perspective, where I think we are is in a better position than a lot of firms, because we have such broad adoption. We can start taking a look at, well, where is this actually impacting it? Initially, it was attorneys who were using these tools were attorneys who had too much work. And so they didn't care, right? They're like, well, I don't care that this saves me 5 hours here that I could bill because I have 5 hours more work over here that I can slot that right in. I think we still see a lot of that because, like most firms, our attorneys have lots of work and they're able to reprioritize and do other work there. But I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. It's things that we're starting to talk about. And I think other firms are talking about. The other one that I think is interesting is, my work is too specialized. There's no way AI can do this.
I would have thought that would have been the one that has the greatest attachment to firms not seeing adoption.
Well, I think it depends. So, at Ogletree, we're, I would say, lucky when it comes to AI adoption in that we have a pretty narrow focus, right? We primarily do labor and employment, and we do immigration. And then we have some other, subspecialties in there. But we don't have as wide of a breadth as some of your general practice firms. We don't have to deal with transactional work for the most part. We don't have, all these other different litigation practice groups out there that we're focused on. So we still have a lot of specialization. We have a lot of really, really good attorneys who've been practicing for a long time. But I think the technology has gotten a lot better. When ChatGPT launched back in 2022, right into 2022, you couldn't use that for anything reliably. It was great for some things. You could do summarization, you could do basic things, but it would give you back a few hundred words. It would hallucinate half of the time. The technology now is just so much better, so much more accurate. Even I get impressed now when I put, a couple thousand documents into a vault and I'm asking questions and it's actually giving me responsive answers, and it's not running out of context, and it's not repeating itself or forgetting or, going in a loop. So I think it's come a long way, but also as people use the technology more, they realize where it should be used and where it shouldn't be used. Definitely do not use any of our tools to draft a motion for summary judgment. It's not going to go well for you, but use our tools to help you draft portions of it. Use our tools to help you locate evidence. Use our tools to help you do, chronologies and things like that, that are tasks that you can offload to it and review and have some confidence in it. And so I think that's where it's come from, is that my work is too specialized, is more come to, well, my work is specialized, but you can help out with these individual pieces here where I may not necessarily have the time I want to dedicate to them and their lower risk opportunities.
Interesting. Kind of threading the needle on adoption, you mentioned, and I know you've done some internal training programs, hackathons with Summers. What do you think for a firm that maybe doesn't have someone in your role or is finally getting on the bandwagon? What's the minimum investment a firm needs to make in AI literacy before tools actually start getting used? Or is that something you should do in parallel? Or how do you think firms should approach it?
For us, it's been really interesting to see how these adoption curves play out, what we've been able to do looking back now, going on 2 or 3 years when we started our journey here. The first thing I would say is that AI requires people. You can't run a serious AI program without staffing it. If you think you can just go out and license a platform and deploy it, you're not going to be anywhere as successful as you would be if you actually had dedicated headcount to help run that. And that was one of the big takeaways we had, because when you look at typical software deployments at a law firm, you buy the software, you have your training department, develop training sessions, you go out, you deploy it to everybody, you have remote sessions, you have in-person sessions, and then everybody's off on their own because the software is intuitive, they know how to use it, or they weren't going to use it anyway. But with AI, it's different. One, there's a use case for literally everyone at your firm. No matter what you're doing, you can find something where you can leverage. If you just draft emails all day, you can use AI to help you draft those emails and make them better and faster and sound nicer. But you need to customize that to meet the people where they are, where the attorneys are, and figure out those use cases. And they're not going to do that on their own because they have too much work. And the learning curve is it's a little too steep. You're going to have maybe 10, 20, 30% your early adopters who are going to be the ones who figure it out, who find the value in it. And you may get organic growth from that. You may get word of mouth growth from that. And you may eventually get there to a 50, 60, 70% adoption rate, but it's going to take you years. If you have the dedicated people to do it, you can move much more quickly. And, one of the things that I think about is if I have a dedicated person who can get me to widespread adoption, let's say 2 months early, right? And in that 2 months, I've generated 100,000 additional prompts or 100,000 additional queries. If each one of those prompts or queries saves me just 1 minute for my attorneys, that's 1,600 hours of time. And so if you think about it like that, that's almost a full year of an attorney billing. I don't have to pay this person an attorney salary because they're not practicing law. When you think about it like that, it starts making sense. You can make those arguments, though it kind of pays for itself. One of the things that we've pivoted to is dedicating to awareness and adoption, right? We still have people, we're still hiring people and have people to develop the tools and locate the tools. But now every conversation we have really starts with, okay, well, how are we going to drive adoption of this tool? Because going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you don't have people using the tool, it's not worth your effort. It's just as important that you have the person to help people use the tool as having the tool itself. And so at Ogletree, I've had a lot of success in being able to make that argument and being able to grow our team, grow our innovation team to be able to support that type of adoption. And so that would be what I would say is probably the most important thing, is to think through how can you get help to do this? Because if you're just one person, you're going to be really limited in how you're able to drive change at your organization because you just don't have the capacity to do multiple things.
Kind of going down the path here of building the team, buy versus build. You spoke about this back in October at the Legal Tech Connect conference, being a false binary. Can you unpack that a little bit? What really is the question that firms should be asking themselves, or the vendor community?
It's never buy versus build. The false dichotomy there is it's buy and build. Nobody is going out there and only buying and only building. Neither one of those is going to be a successful strategy, because if you're only buying, you aren't able to serve your smaller communities within your firm. All you have are big, broad solutions that you can sell off the shelf. And so building needs to come in to fill in the gaps. And even if you are buying, you still need somebody to come in and build and customize it, right? If you've got Harvey, if you've got Legora, if you've got co-counsel, if you've got any of these big legal broad solutions, you still need somebody to come in and, build out your workflows or your agents, or figure out how to use it and customize it and fine tune it and come up with, your prompts and other things there to help you build something that actually works there. And so I think, it's really important that every firm out there considers, well, how would we go out and how would we build something? Obviously, you're not going to go out and build a big replacement for Westlaw or Lexis or Harvey or any of those, but you can build smaller solutions. You can build smaller tools, or you can figure out how you adapt these tools to build your own custom applications within that. I think it's important that people really think about what can we build, because it really empowers you to have more freedom and have more capability to do that. I'm lucky, right? I have a development team. I have experience with software development. All that makes it easier. You can just go into Claude, like I was saying, and build out your own apps, right? You can build them out. You can build out those proof of concepts. And then you don't necessarily have to build that yourself. You could take that to a vendor and partner with a vendor and locate a trusted vendor and say, okay, here's what I've built. I've already shown it to my firm. They love it, but we want to scale this. Can you take my app I've built here and scale it? That way, you don't necessarily have to have, an entire dev team. AI has made building much easier for law firms. You just have to recognize that what you build still needs to be deployed, and that there's real cost associated with that, and that you set those expectations from the beginning.
I want to make a mental note that we circle back to this and the comment you made earlier about lawyers are trained to become experts almost overnight on a topic and then dig into that for 6 months and then do that again. And there's a little bit of hubris that comes with that. Those two things collide, and now we see kind of vibe coding, and I won't say who, but there's people on LinkedIn talking about trying to do this at scale. But before we do that, I have a few more questions on this topic about buy versus build. So you do have a very unique perspective, having been at Legalmation. You were the builder, and now at Ogletree, you are the buyer and orchestrator and builder as well. For someone who hasn't been on the vendor side, who has a role like yours, what would you coach them on in terms of what you know now, having been a vendor? How do you evaluate vendors now? And what would you tell someone who's never been a vendor that they might not naturally think of as they're going through that evaluation process?
I think it does give me a good perspective, and I try and be sympathetic to our vendors because I've been on the other side of those phone calls. I think one, maybe I should apologize on this podcast to all of the vendors that I've worked with, because I think I hold them to a higher standard. And usually when I'm on the call with them, it's because something's gone wrong and I get to, be the bad cop or play the heavy to try and get things going well. But what I would say for vendors, the number one thing that you can do is make us look good, right? We're on your side. When I bring you into a pitch, I have brought you into that pitch because I think you have a good product. And if you come into that pitch and I've got, our stakeholders, I've got our innovation council, or I've got our COO or other people who are the real decision makers. If you come in and don't make us look good, there's nothing I can do for you, right? I can't help you with that. So when you're going into these, it's not necessarily an adversarial sales pitch. When people try and do the hard sell on me, or they try and ask me all the questions to try and, before they even show me the product, to try and convince me of why I need the product before they've shown it to me, that just doesn't go well. You have to assume when people in the innovation space are having these conversations and demos with you, we want to like your product, right? If your product works, we both look good. We both win here. And so it's in your best interest to figure out what it is that you can do to make us both look good to the people that we're trying to sell it to, because we're both selling it. I'm a salesperson inside the firm. Now, I don't necessarily get paid a commission, right? My evaluation is different, but when I launch a product or want to build a product, I still have to go through that sales exercise there. And so I think that would be the number one thing to do, is to think about how you can partner together to figure out what the best way is to present that, so you put your best foot forward. I also would say one of my, pet peeves is when I can't see your product, right? I, being a vendor, having been on the vendor side, I can tell so much more about a product and if it's going to work, seeing a demo of it, than a PowerPoint. So if you give me a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation, all I'm going to ask is, I want to see the product, and we're going to have to schedule another call to see it. So just for me in particular, and maybe that's just my nuance, I definitely want to see the product early. And the last thing I would say goes back to that first part, that we're on the same team, is that if I tell you, no, it's not a good fit, it's not a whatever for it, it's not because I need to be sold more, right? I don't need to get 20 emails from you explaining all the new features and try and have calls. I'll tell you, I'll be like, let's touch base in 3 months. Let's touch base in 6 months. Yeah. That's my way of preserving the relationship and seeing, because things can change on both sides. You may have new features, you may have other things, but it's not me being the gatekeeper. It's me saying, it's just not worth the time to try to waste your time when it's ultimately not going to be successful at the firm. So I think with all of the VC funding and all the money coming in and all of that with legal tech now, I think a lot of those sales tactics from outside that may work with other companies are starting to infiltrate certain vendors where they are much pushier, they are much more aggressive, they are doing all these things. From my perspective, that's not how I like to be sold. I like to have a conversation. I like to see the product, and maybe that's I'm too old school in that space. But those would be my recommendations for folks to try and have that relationship, show your product, work as a partnership, and recognize it's a long-term relationship. People move around a lot. You don't want to burn any bridges. And so just try and be professional in those interactions that you have.
Thank you for that. You answered the second question I was going to ask, is where do some of these relationships go wrong? And I think you just hit the nail on the head from a sales standpoint, not being overly aggressive, which I think is fair. So when we look at the ecosystem and you look at the Legal Tech Hub map, it's like size 0.5 font now because there's so many logos and icons. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And there's vertical point solutions that span all ranges of practice areas. From where you sit and evaluating all of it, is that model sustainable, or does it start to create a sprawl problem?
It's crazy, right? I think Legal Tech Hub reported there's like 800 new legal tech companies in 2025. We just got stats. I saw an article today that we're on track for more investment in legal tech in 2026 than 2025, which I thought was way, back in 2026, 27, when we were starting Legal Nation, I wish we could have had funding like they're doing now. That would have been a whole different ballgame. I don't think anybody would tell you it's sustainable. It's so hard to differentiate a legal tech product now. And you also have the specter hanging over everyone of the frontier models, right? You have Claude, who just released their Word plugin. OpenAI is trying to recapture to be the front runner in all space. And then you have Gemini out there, plus other companies that are working on their own tools there. So I think it's both a great time to start a legal tech company because there's a lot of easy money out there, but it's also a very difficult time because how are you going to differentiate your product from all of these? It used to be 2 years ago, all you needed to do was slap a custom front end on ChatGPT, add some custom prompting instruction, all of that, maybe a few features, and you go out and sell that. But now more sophisticated firms are like, well, I can just build that, right? I don't need you to do that. I don't even actually need that because I'm just going to deploy Claude to more users, and I'm going to give Claude maybe a skill, or I'm going to give Claude an artifact, and I'm going to deploy that and do it that way. So I do think that we will see, I hope to see some consolidation. I think it is growing too fast. I think also it's hard to stay on top of it. Earlier in the process, 3 years ago, when all of this really kicked off, we had a tracker. We would track every single company that was out there, which ones we've talked to, what we thought about their product, who the contact was, all of that. That's not possible right now. And so it's also hard for us to find the diamonds in the roughs. What are the products that would actually be valuable for us to have and for us to use? Because we're always interested in those and what's next for us and what's the hot new thing out there that we'd be interested in. So yeah, I think we'll see more, I hope we'll see more of this consolidation of the market. But I also do wonder because there's just not enough spend in legal to match all of the investment that's going on there. And that's another thing that we wonder about as well, is this company going to be around in 3 years? Like, what's going to happen? Because it could get acquired, which may or may not be good. We've seen acquisitions go well where the product improves, but we've also seen acquisitions go poorly where the product has not done well. And in that case, you have made a big investment in it. And so that's a concern that we have when we look at a product is, well, it's great to be early in the stage and get in when they're new and you can be one of their first customers and you can capitalize on all that and the hype and the marketing. But it also sets you up that you're stuck potentially with this vendor, because after I get 100 attorneys, 200 attorneys, 300 attorneys using a product, the difficulty in pivoting them to a new product is substantial, especially if we've uploaded data into that. If we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents in a platform, we've got hundreds of thousands of prompts or queries in that. How do I migrate that to another platform? And so those are all things that we're thinking about now when we have these conversations is, what does the future of this company look like? And is that something that we should be concerned about? Because we don't have control necessarily over that. And I think some of the valuations of these companies require them to basically have every single AmLaw 200 firm paying them multi-million dollars for their valuation to actually stack up. and you have like 10 companies with that valuation. So they can't all have all of the AmLaw 200 there. And so it does make me wonder, it's like everything with AI. Is it a bubble? I don't think it's a bubble, but at some point there is going to be, I think, some reckoning and realization, and especially with these companies that are able to just keep raising and increasing their valuation. At some point, somebody's got to run the numbers and be like, law firms are notoriously frugal when it comes to spending, especially on technology. And so I think we will start to see some pulling back as the market matures, as more firms really start reaching that next level of maturation in their AI journey.
Great segue, because Tim, the thing we're starting to see now more, and this, I'm not going to say this is every firm in the AmLaw 200 or even the AmLaw 50, but we are seeing firms that are making bigger bets, go to foundational models like Claude. That seems to be the one people are talking about most these days, really as a horizontal layer that they can control and own. And then as you get those niche use cases that, I've got the 5 lawyers in my ERISA practice that need something really unique, and I could either spend 6 months going and demoing and going through a POC and infosec and contract review, or I just go build something on top of Claude that meets that vertical need as we go. How do you see that play out versus, without naming names, the big AI vendors that we see today? Is there a world where both can coexist, or do you see a future where eventually some firms own their own destiny and start to build everything themselves?
It's a question I think that a lot of firms, to your point, are looking at. Us as well. We have big legal specific providers, and then we also have, frontier models available. I think it's still too early to see how exactly that's going to play out. I also, going back to my earlier point, like legal is a relatively niche market when it comes to tech spend. It's more than it's ever been. But historically, it hasn't been super attractive. When we started Legalmation 10 years ago, we learned that lesson the hard way, that just because you have a great idea and you say, if I just get 1%, right? 1% of the legal spend, that's $1 billion company. But that's every legal tech company says, I just need 1%. And getting there is far harder than you think. So I think what we're seeing with Claude is super interesting. Cowork, the plugin, the legal plugin they just announced the Word plugin. They have all of these other things that are there. But we have Claude at the firm. We're currently piloting it. And it's a great tool. It is a great platform, but it doesn't replace everything that we can do with our legal specific tools. And we have attorneys who say, I actually like what we have over here more than what we have in Claude. And Claude has other limitations. I think also they're figuring it out. Right now, Cowork was a huge thing. And I think there were all these LinkedIn posts about Cowork, and going back to your other thing about people posting on LinkedIn, I vibe coded a replacement for Harvey and Legore over the weekend. It's so easy to do, right? That really misses the mark, because the value of the platforms is the governance, the security, the structure, all of those unsexy things that you need to feel secure in a regulated environment like legal, that your data's safe, that your clients will allow you to use it, that it's going to be around, that you can integrate it, that you can do all of those things. And so Coworks, for example, is a super useful platform, but I don't know of any firm that can safely deploy that and comply with their governance obligations outside of like a sandbox environment, because there's no audit trails for it. It still can do things that you don't want it to do. Even if you put safeguards and limit it, you don't have complete control over it. And so from my perspective, it's super interesting, but that's probably where we'll be in a couple of years. I don't think we're there yet. There are other things that you can do that are very powerful with the platform and other things like that. But I also just don't know how much it's worth for these frontier models to spend a lot of time in legal, because it's a very competitive market. There's a lot there. And OpenAI was an initial big investor in Harvey. So if they come and try and go after the legal market, they're kind of cannibalizing what they invested in for Harvey and what Harvey was supposed to do for them. When you look at Harvey and you look at Legore and you look at CoCounsel, there's not a lot of room left in the market to say, okay, well, let's try and replace, as I was saying earlier, to get off one of those platforms after you've had it for years is a huge transition cost. It's never going to have the exact same features. You're going to have upset attorneys, all of that. And the last thing I would say is not everybody needs the latest and the greatest, right? This is something that we used to talk about when I practiced, is like, well, does the motion have to be perfect, right? Do we need to spend another 20 hours on it, or are we going to win on the basis that we have here, and let's save the client money? Or do we need to retain this expert? Do we need to do this deposition? You're always having those kind of conversations in your mind to figure out, how do we win this case most economically? And I think it's the same with AI. If you can get with a current tool to 80%, and 80% is enough to win your case, you don't need to spend that extra time and that money to get to 100%. We see that all the time. We have attorneys who don't necessarily need to have the latest and the greatest. They're happy with what they have, and that's what they know how to use, and that's where they get the benefit from. So trying to get everybody up onto the latest model, onto the latest this, is just going to lead to a lot of frustration on your part, but also on your user's part, because once you have something that works well, you just want to keep it. I get annoyed anytime, some app automatically updates, and now I have to figure out where these new features are and do all this new stuff. And I'm like, no, it was fine how it was. I liked it how it was. Even if you've made it better, you haven't necessarily made it better for me. We'll see how all of this plays out. I could be wrong, and all of a sudden, we have Gemini and Claude and OpenAI is what everybody's using. But I don't think we're going to see that. I think that there's too much of a barrier to entry that's already been set up, and other concerns in security where the vendors we have now are also much more customized. You can't get somebody on the phone at Anthropic unless you're paying them, I think, close to $500,000. And so what do you do in that scenario? And the same goes for all these other vendors, these other frontier models, where I just don't think we're big enough fish for them to want to jump into our pond here.
Yeah, Tim, I heard something else adjacent to this where you get the big three, Harvey, Lagora, co-counsel. And I was talking with a friend of mine at a firm, and they said, hey, look, there's some really cool technology coming out and vendors that I'm really interested in. But at the end of the day, if I were to pick one of them over one of those three and there was a problem, I'm going to be in a lot of hot water, because there's some safety in buying one of those three products that if it does make a mistake, no one got fired for buying IBM. No one got fired for buying one of those three. And if I go down the path with a newer company, and it could yield the same problem, or hallucinate a case just like Harvey or Lagora could, but because it's not a name brand, it puts me in hot water. So now all of a sudden, and I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from starting any software companies or AI companies, but there's almost this safety in numbers that people that are in the space are looking at, saying, I really don't know that I want to stick my neck out and be, to your point, on the bleeding edge. So it's just an interesting place we find ourselves in. Being at Ogletree, labor and employment laws, heavily driven by regulatory data. You got OSHA, DOL statistics, lots of other things. How do you see all of that changing the way firms like Ogletree or your competitors, or big firms with large labor and employment practices, counsel proactively rather than reactively?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the impact that data can have for our attorneys and for our clients. So I think the regulatory data, and this also ties into earlier topic, regulatory data is one piece of it, and what you can get from the government and what's available there is huge, because that's really going to be cross industry, cross everything. The other piece of that is we have our own internal data, right? If we've been representing a client for an extended period of time and we've been handling a significant amount of their work, if you put those two together, you can start answering some interesting questions. And previously, it was just too much work to do it. If you wanted to do it, it would have to be a manual process to do it, one client at a time, one customer at a time, and figure out how to pull that data. Now with AI, it's gotten a lot easier, because a lot of this data, even though it's quantitative, it should be numerical data, it's stored in a qualitative fashion. And to be able to merge the two of those to say, okay, well, what were the causes of action asserted in these complaints, and these, let's say 5,000 complaints across this industry that were presented, and what are we able to pull from court dockets across this? All of that data is going to be textual. You previously would have to develop your own taxonomy. You'd have to develop your own extraction algorithms. You'd have to figure out how you can pull it from APIs or other ways. You'd have to OCR. All of that middle piece is now, that extraction piece is done by AI in a fraction of the time. And so I think that makes the data be a lot more accessible. But going back to what I was saying earlier, like, I'm a data person. I understand data. I know how to talk about it and use it, but I'm not the one talking to clients. I'm not the one trying to sell them on things. And I don't know what a particular client cares about, because not every client is data driven, right? You can go to a client and say, oh, I can predict your litigation spend over the next 3 to 5 years, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, that doesn't matter to me. What I'm actually focused on is the same things you are. I need to drive AI adoption. I have all this advice that I need to give to the board on how we prepare our people. I need to lay off XYZ number of people because of this. And so there can be a disconnect for us as data people to focus too much on the data and think the data is the most important thing, when a lot of times it's figuring out when and where that data actually adds value. And that's, I think, the important thing. And that's really where you need the attorneys. You need them to come in and to help. They have the relationship with the client. They know what's going on, and they can tell you, like, this is where that matters and this is where it's not going to matter. Because if it's not going to matter, it doesn't really justify spending the time to provide all of that insight and data to them.
We like to end these sessions, Tim, and I think a lot of firms, maybe not so much with AI, because some firms feel this is the first time in 30 years that I've been in the space where the lawyers are driving adoption more than IT forcing tools on lawyers, right? The tables have turned a little bit. But from a data standpoint, you mentioned you're a data guy, which I know you are. And if we were to go back and look at that sort of unsexy back end of AI or analytics in general, we like to kind of give folks that are maybe just starting their journey with data some practical tips and advice. You've gone down this path. You kind of know what this looks like. For firms that feel like, hey, before I go down the path of getting my data all sorted out, I really need a data strategy. I need to get data governance. I should have a data council or data committee. Before I do anything else, how would you counsel firms to sequence events? Should they do that before they start getting their data in a central data platform? Should they do those things in parallel? Should you flip the order? What have you seen be effective?
That's a tough question. It's kind of chicken and the egg, right? Which should come first? What I would recommend is probably a dual track approach, doing two things concurrently, because I think the two most important things you can do on the one hand are start showing the value of your data. And you don't need a committee. You don't need an expert. You don't need anything other than some data that you want to answer questions about available to you. And then what you want to show with that data, because that's going to really help you sell the value of this to people who may not understand it, who aren't data people. But on the other side, you need some sort of group. You need a working group. You need a steering committee. You need something else, because no single person in any firm of any reasonable size can drive an initiative forward. If you're on the attorney side, to your point, you probably don't have IT on your side. And if you're on the IT or the innovation side, you probably don't have the attorneys on your side. And so you need to have a group that contains both of those people to say, yes, this is a good idea. Yes, let's go to firm leadership. Yes, you have support for this. And so to get that group to support it, you also need the data. You need that data. You need that initial thing that you've built to show them the value of it. And so that's really where I would start. If you start trying to come up with a comprehensive data strategy or drafting policies or governance or any of that, you're going to get bogged down. You need to have something that's exciting, that gets people interested in it. And then all of that can come later. It will come at a law firm in particular. You're going to come up with governance. You're going to come up with policies. You're going to come up with that strategy, but save that for when you are ready to do that. Because if you can't get buy-in from firm leadership at the beginning for what you want to do, then there's no point in drafting all those governance and all those policies, because they're not going to go anywhere. The other thing I would say on top of that, as we've been discussing, is AI has made it so much easier. Now, all you need to really be able to do is ask the question, and then the AI tool can go out and tell you how to get that data. It can even write the API calls for you to go pull the data, or it can write the scraper for you, or it can draft the email for you to send off to your DBA team to say, hey, can you pull these tables? Can you pull this data for me? Here's some draft SQL code that may or may not be helpful for that. And so I think AI has made it much, much easier for people to get into the data, because all you have to do now is be able to ask the question. You don't necessarily need to understand the structure of it and how it all relates.
One last thing. So if you were trying to convey a message to the leaders of law firms, what mindset do you think law firm leaders need to develop the most to see the shift from where we are now to where things are headed in the next few years?
I think what would be most helpful, or what I've seen for law firm leaders, is to go spend a few hours using the AI tools that are out there. Just go slide and sign up for a Claude personal account or a ChatGPT personal or Gemini, or if you have platforms available at your firm, just commit to actually spending time to use that tool how you would in your practice. In general, that's going to give you that sort of aha moment, that epiphany of, oh, this is different. This does have the potential to impact how we practice law. And once you have that mindset, I think it starts flowing down to your discussions, to your decisions, to say, we do need to actually think about this, because it's not going away. It's only getting better. It's been 3.5 years now, and it's only grown in adoption and usage. I do think that most firm leaders are aware of that conceptually. They know that this is coming, but until they actually see how it would change how they practice law, it's a little difficult to articulate that. But if they do that, and then they have all of their practice group leaders or other senior attorneys at the firm, and even on like the administrative side of the house, having your directors, that's a big portion. Every firm has just as many admins side as they usually have legal side. And so having them go through that exercise as well to really think about it helps figure out where the firm's going to go, what you should be doing, what tools are there. And it also is really helpful, because the more you use AI, the less you worry about it taking your job. because you understand its limitations. You recognize that this is not a agentic AGI. This still requires human in the loop for almost everything. That also gives more confidence in them to say, okay, we're not losing our jobs. Let's figure out how we adopt this. Let's figure out how we move forward. So that would be the biggest piece of advice I have, is spend a day doing all of your work with an AI assistant of your choice. And then when you come away from that, I think that will really help guide your decision-making process and where you want to direct your firm to go.
That's awesome. Tim, we're at time. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and insights with us today. That's it for this episode. And if you enjoyed the conversation, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss the next episode. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time on Overruled by Data. That's a wrap for this episode of Overruled by Data. If this podcast resonated with you, if you took one or two things away from it, you want to hear more from law firm leaders that have been there and done that, hit the follow button.